Start with recording. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me change this. Speaker view. Okay, that's what I want. Why don't you give me your name and spell it for me, and then your title.
Heather Tafel, Tafel, and I am an associate professor of political science at Grand Valley State University.
Is your specialty Russian studies?
Yes, Russian politics.
Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, a lot of turmoil right now in the region. Why don't we talk about why you feel Americans need to be engaged and take interest and pay attention to what's happening there? Because quite often we don't.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, what the major issues that Russia is bringing up with its amassing of troops on the Ukrainian border is in a lot of ways, a reconsideration of the entire European security infrastructure. And that is one that the US is severely or heavily invested in through NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so it matters to Americans in that the US has committed troops in NATO and that Russia, in a lot of ways, is questioning this infrastructure, especially as it has expanded since the end of the Cold War to Eastern European countries, those that were in the former Soviet bloc, as well as those that were part of the Soviet Union, for example, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So I think in a lot of ways, given the US commitment to NATO, the US as a founding member of NATO, that this really impacts potentially American military commitments.
So you mentioned Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. They are members of NATO, correct?
Yes, they are members of NATO.
Okay, so why is Ukraine then? I mean, obviously those countries border Russia. Why is Ukraine so important to them then?
To NATO or to Russia?
To Russia. So why are they like drawing a red line there?
In a lot of ways, Russia has never, even under Boris Yeltsin, the president in the 1990s, and then under Putin, Russia has been in a lot of ways has responded to NATO expansion either ambivalently or outright hostilely, and was given some reassurances back in 1990 that NATO would not expand. And then when it did, was given other reassurances, no, we're not going to do it again. So there has been some ambiguity with regards to NATO's purpose, at least in Russia's minds. And so having NATO in Ukraine, a country that is even deeper in terms of Russia's border, deeper towards Russia, is really problematic for Russia, in that there have been various claims made by NATO that what it's doing is not threatening, but in Russia's eyes, it does seem threatening. In 2014, the pro-Russian president was ousted in mass demonstrations, and from Russia's perspective, that was seen as a Western, that in a lot of ways that the West had promoted those protests, had even inspired those protests, and even machinated those protests. So in Russia, in the eyes of the leadership, the West is actively promoting regime change in its neighbors, and then actively promoting potential NATO membership in a country like Ukraine.
Okay. So you had mentioned that Americans need to be cautious about making certain assumptions, one being that this is all about Putin and his like a power grab.
I mean, there's, to a certain extent, it's not entirely false that a lot of this is about Putin, given that the center of power is in his hands. But at the same time, focusing too much on Putin neglects the fact that there is some support for some of Russia's concerns about NATO. There is some support for Russia's concerns about even the Ukrainian government, um, and um, and some support for Russia's attempts to try to promote its interests and to try to get the West and NATO to recognize that it has legitimate security interests. There's quite a bit of domestic support for those notions. So if we focus too much on Putin, it seems like it's just what he wants and not necessarily what the rest of Russia wants. And that's why I would caution against placing too much emphasis on Putin, as if he has a very different view from his fellow Russians.
So it's your belief that it's not his intention to sort of recreate the Soviet Union, correct?
Not in terms of the territory of the Soviet Union. In a lot of ways, I think what Russia's leadership wants is for the West to recognize that Russia is a great power, that Russia has its own security interests, and that Russia has special relationships with countries of the former Soviet Union, and that it reserves the right to have its own sort of privileged sphere of interest in those areas of the former Soviet Union. And in that way, Russia, in a lot of ways, wants to be recognized internationally as a powerful actor like the Soviet Union was. But but the relationship with other countries, are at least in terms of Russia trying to annex territory, I don't see that as Russia recreating the Soviet Union territory, but rather perhaps maybe the Soviet Union's influence.
So then, I mean, from a United States perspective, if it was us, and you know, we were in the same position as Putin, and someone was trying to uh, influence us politically in Mexico or Canada, let's say, we would probably react the same way. Um, so why don't we? I mean, why don't we give them a little bit of what they want?
That has also some potential. There are quite a number of fears that, you know, just placating the leadership will lead to other kinds of claims on the part of the leadership, because not everything that what the Russian leadership claims is backed up with empirical evidence. So in other words, they're making claims about genocide in Eastern Ukraine, those kinds of things. So one has to be cautious, but nonetheless, I think that a sort of a broader discussion about the architecture of European security, perhaps to at least try to draw Russia into maybe a bigger sort of treaty negotiation to try to recognize Russia's claims to an extent, but also limiting then future incursions or future claims perhaps on other countries. So this, in a lot of ways, goes beyond just merely leveling sanctions against Russia, and or even saying, okay, fine, Ukraine would not be a member of NATO. I think that needs to be sort of a broader discussion, perhaps similar to what the West and the Soviet Union did in the 70s with the Helsinki Agreement. And just to give a bit of credit here, this is an argument that I read in Foreign Affairs recently by the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul. And I think it makes quite a lot of sense to do that, to also anchor Russia in that infrastructure, which right now Russia is in a lot of ways on the outside of that.
I mean, isn't it really risky, though, from an international standpoint, for Putin to keep pushing and pushing and pushing on this in terms of like what he did yesterday with recognizing those breakaway territories? At some point, could it backfire?
Potentially, but keep in mind that Russia has also recognized other regions, for example, Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia. So what happened yesterday might be seen as quite monumental. I'm actually surprised they haven't done it earlier. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's not serious, but in a lot of ways, it doesn't to my mind, sort of mean that much has significantly changed, at least in terms of recognition. Now, things could be happening right now on the ground that would completely falsify what I'm saying here. But there is a bigger risk if, say, for example, they were to have more Russian troops moving into the eastern parts. That would be, and or sort of moving away from the Luhansk and Donetsk further into Ukraine. That certainly would. And yes, there is a big risk here on the part of the Russian leadership. The Russian population is not necessarily in favor of a war with Ukraine. And a majority of the Russian population sees Ukraine as a different country and would like to have friendly relations with that country. So, and Putin does actually care about public support. The regime does care about public support. So we'll see, if indeed that public support really would matter in terms of them being much more cautious than perhaps what they appear to be right now.
And what about the sanctions? I mean, I think more and more is coming out about them. I don't know all the specifics, but is that an effective way to slow Putin, or in reaction to this?
I'm not so sure, given the fact that there have been sanctions leveled against Russia for a variety of previous actions, also related to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the killing of Sergei Magnitsky. So I'm not sure that sanctions are going to make a big dent here. They do send a signal. But that's why I think that beyond sanctions, sort of something more imaginative, at least in terms of a broader, bigger diplomatic discussions need to occur. What I thought was interesting this morning too is that the German government, Olaf Scholz, has announced that the Nord Stream pipeline would be halted, or at least in terms of its certification. That is not the first time that's happened, but that is actually quite interesting, an interesting development. Many people had questioned what the German government's position there was. So, so these might be sort of actions that might give the Russian government pause, perhaps. But again, I think that they're probably not going to make a big difference.
And this may not be your area of expertise, but what about economically here in the U.S.? If should there be a war, or if these sanctions are put into place, what would be the impact to our economy?
I think in a lot of ways, it will mostly affect energy prices. So Americans who are feeling the pinch in terms of, and most of us are, in terms of inflation, very likely that energy prices will reverberate out. That is not my expertise, whether up or down, but I suspect up. And that's I think where it's mostly going to hit Americans and the economy. Not to mention stock markets, right? For people who have portfolios, but yeah, so that is something that I think that Americans should pay attention to. But we also need to keep in mind that the NATO is not a member of, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and the administration, the U.S. administration, has made it clear that, that they won't necessarily, send troops. They won't send troops to Ukraine in this event, since Ukraine is not a NATO member.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think is important for us to talk about?
One last thing, I think what's really important, it seems that this crisis, maybe for some people, it seems that this maybe popped out of nowhere. And this has actually been bubbling for quite some time, even longer than since 2014. And in part, it does relate to the strength of Russia, the modernization of Russia's army, and those kinds of things. So I do think that this is very serious. And something that Americans should pay attention to over the longer term, even if the crisis seems to subside, in that unless like some bigger discussions happen, it's probably not going away.
Historically, we're pretty isolationist, right? In terms of, that's Europe, it's happening over there.
Yeah,
We're
in
not
terms
worried
of
about it.
knowledge, for sure, for sure. Yeah, Americans do not pay as good attention perhaps to foreign affairs. But understandably, it's hard. There's a lot of the rest of the world, and it's a lot to keep up on.
Sure. All right. Well, I appreciate you talking with us today. We'll definitely have something from this interview in our 5 o'clock news today,
Okay.
and appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure.
Awesome.